Work is already underway on the Biden administration's new national defense strategy. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says the new strategy will be out sometime in 2022. Becca Wasser is a fellow in the defense program at the Center for a New American Security. Becca, welcome. Thanks very much for coming on. The sense that I take so far from the national security priorities that Secretary Austin and President Biden have laid out so far is that the priorities are not going to be much different than they have been for the past 4 years. What's your sense of how executing a strategy might be different in the new administration than we've seen for the past 4 years?
Sure. So the Biden administration has inherited a number of challenges, and we have some really pressing ones. And the one that is most pressing is COVID-19. So you're going to see that taking up a lot of bandwidth at the U.S. Department of Defense, as well as across government. But if you're looking at the national defense strategy more specifically, you are entirely right. It is probably going to follow a lot of the same contours as the last national defense strategy that was published in 2018. You know, the hallmark of that strategy is strategic competition with Russia and China. The slight difference that we're going to see in probably the next national defense strategy is going to be ensuring that China is elevated as the #1 challenge, and ensuring that, the U.S. is competing to a very specific end goal and a very specific objective. So we can expect that the next national defense strategy is going to clarify what those end goals and objectives might be, as well as setting a very clear role for the U.S. military, because ultimately competition is a whole of government approach, but the U.S. military has a very special and unique element to add to that. And you can expect the next national defense strategy to clarify exactly what that might be.
The most common theme I think I took away from the 2018 NDS, Becca, was that folks, experts both on the program and off the air, consistently said, wow, we've never seen anybody explicitly name China as the high-level threat that NDS did. A lot of folks have made a comparison to how the Obama administration talked about China and tried to work with China, comparing that to the Trump administration's approach, and now are trying to maybe imply that the Biden administration will kind of go back to the way it was before. Is that realistic given what we've learned about China and given some of the actions that China's taken over the past 4 to 6 years?
I think we're going to see a mix of both approaches. I think we're going to see a bit of a hard stance towards China when it comes down to some of the activities that have, frankly, been intended to erode some of the United States' technological and military edge. So, we'll see some of those harder stances to ensure that China isn't taking steps that will ultimately erode some of the U.S. advantages that would enable it to, be successful in strategic competition and in case of a potential conflict in the future. But you are also going to see engagement with China on some key issues, mainly in the diplomatic sphere, to just ensure that China doesn't become, a global pariah, or in that the United States and China are set on some type of, collision course that would unnecessarily lead us to conflict. So I think that's what we should expect to see. I also think that, if we're looking for what's going to be really different in the next national defense strategy and what's going to change, the same way that the last strategy elevated China, I think we're going to see an elevation of transnational threats. And traditionally, when we think of transnational threats, we think of terrorism. Instead, in this case, we're going to see an elevation of transnational threats like global pandemics, as well as climate change, issues that span across the globe and are long-term challenges that we need to start shaping potential strategies to mitigate some of the damage that those might cause.
In that theme, would something like a non-state actor in the cyber realm be a transnational threat that maybe not necessarily addressed directly in an NDS, but that sounds like the kind of thing that you're alluding to there, Becca?
Absolutely. I think we've already seen, noise from the Biden administration that cybersecurity is going to be elevated. It's incredibly timely after the SolarWinds attack. But what I think we really need to note here is that usually cyber attacks are coming from nation states. And here I think is the biggest concern. So you can have non-state actors using cyber attacks against the United States, but more often than not, they are tied in some way to adversary nations that, once again, are trying to erode some of the US advantages, steal pertinent information, and use that in that way. So ultimately, I think we do need to be concerned about cyber security and cyber attacks, but it's going to be trying to enhance things like attribution. So we can identify where those seemingly non-state actors may or may not actually be tied to nation states that are trying to cause some grievous harm to our national security.
We have about a minute left, Becca. One of the critiques of just about every strategy of every sort that is produced in Washington is the alignment of the execution of that strategy to the budget realities. Which comes first, the money or the strategy? How do you expect that to play out in the Biden administration? Any sense of whether things will happen in one direction or the other?
Well, right now, the budget is the priority at the Department of Defense. There was a really contentious transition that took place with the Biden-Harris transition team and, then folks at the Department of Defense. And so right now, the folks at DoD are starting from scratch at the budget. And so their priority is trying to rebuild this and trying to think about ways in which will happen. If we're reading the tea leaves, it definitely looks as though the defense budget is going to remain as is, if not drop significantly. So that's going to really enable DoD to have to prioritize, what are the top line items? What are the priority challenges that they need to address? And how is it that they could do it if the resources remain the same or diminish slightly?
Becca Wasser, thanks very much for joining me. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.